Why clarity usually arrives after you start. There's a version of starting that most people are waiting for. The version where you feel ready, where the path is clear, the plan is solid, and the uncertainty has resolved itself into something manageable. Where you know enough to begin with confidence, and the first step feels less like a leap and more like a natural extension of everything you've already figured out. For some people, that moment never comes. Not because the project isn't right or the goal isn't worth pursuing, but because clarity, it turns out, isn't what starting requires. It's what starting produces. This distinction sounds small. It isn't. The assumption that's holding you back. The assumption most people operate under is that the sequence goes: think, plan, get clear, then act. Clarity first, movement second. And this assumption feels reasonable. Why would you start something you don't fully understand? Why move before you know where you're going? But this is almost exactly backwards from how clarity actually works in practice. When you're outside of something, looking at it from a distance, thinking about it theoretically, you can only access a certain kind of understanding. You can see the shape of it. You can anticipate some of what it will require. You can build a mental model that feels accurate and thorough. But the real texture of the work, what it actually demands, where the real problems are, what you need to know that you don't yet know, none of that is visible from the outside. It only becomes visible once you're in it. Think about the last time you started something you've been planning for a while. The moment you actually began. Whether it was writing the first page, making the first call, showing up for the first session, something shifted. The project stopped being theoretical and became actual. And in that shift, you probably discovered things that weeks of planning hadn't surfaced. Problem you hadn't anticipated. A step that turned out to be easier than expected. A direction that only became obvious once you were already moving. That's not failure. That's how learning actually works. This is why experienced people in almost any field give the same advice. Start before you feel ready. Not because preparation doesn't matter, it does. But because the most important preparation happens during the doing, not before it. Action generates information. There's a concept in design thinking called learning by doing, the idea that action generates information that thinking alone cannot. When you build a prototype, you discover problems that no amount of planning would have revealed. When you write a first draft, you find out what you actually think about something, not what you thought you thought. When you start the business, the gym habit, the creative project, the act of starting teaches you things about the project and about yourself that were simply not available before. This isn't a motivational idea. It's a practical one. A writer who plans a chapter for 2 weeks and a writer who writes a bad draft in 2 hours are not equally positioned to write the second chapter. The one who drafted knows what the chapter actually is. Its real rhythm, its unresolved problems, the moment where the argument breaks down. The one who planned knows what they hoped it would be. Those are very different kinds of knowledge, and only one of them moves the work forward. The information you need to move forward is often only generated by moving forward. Waiting for clarity before starting means waiting for information that can only arrive after you've begun. The weight of the unstarted. There's also something happening cognitively when you stay in a state of extended planning without action. The brain, when it holds an unstarted task, keeps it in a kind of open loop, a background process that consumes mental energy without producing output. Psychologists sometimes call this the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished tasks occupy cognitive space disproportionately. They surface at inconvenient moments, in the shower, at dinner, in the last 10 minutes before sleep. They generate low-grade anxiety, a persistent hum of unresolved tension that follows you through the day. The longer you stay in the planning phase, the more these loops accumulate. And the accumulated weight of unstarted things creates a kind of cognitive fog, a vague heaviness that makes starting feel even harder than it already did. The project you've been thinking about for 6 months doesn't feel easier to begin than the project you thought about for a week. Often it feels harder, because it's been sitting in that open loop long enough to grow in the imagination into something larger and more intimidating than it actually is. Starting, even imperfectly, even incompletely, closes the loop. Or at least begins to. The act of beginning releases something. The project stops being a looming abstraction and becomes a concrete thing you're actually doing. And concrete things are far easier to think clearly about than abstract ones. You can see where it needs work. You can make real decisions. You can respond to what's actually there rather than to your projection of what might be. What the waiting is really about. Fear plays a significant role here that's worth naming directly. For many people, the waiting isn't really about needing more clarity. It's about needing more certainty. And certainty, the guarantee that this will work, that the effort will be worth it, that the result will justify the risk, is something that no amount of planning can provide. Staying in the planning phase keeps the possibility alive. As long as you haven't started, you haven't failed. The project still exists in its ideal form, unspoiled by the friction of execution. The novel you haven't written is still the novel it could be. The business you haven't launched is still the business you imagined. And there's a quiet comfort in that preserved possibility, even if it's also a trap. Starting means accepting uncertainty. It means agreeing to find out what's actually there, rather than what you imagine might be. It means allowing the ideal version to collide with reality, and trusting that what survives that collision is more valuable than what you were protecting by never beginning. For some people, that's the hardest part. Not the work itself, but the willingness to trade the safety of the unbegun for the reality of the in-progress. The willingness to find out, even if what you find isn't exactly what you hoped for. The trust that comes from experience. Here's something that changes once you've started enough things. You develop a kind of trust in the process of starting itself. You've been in enough projects, enough first drafts, enough early stages, enough uncomfortable beginnings, to know that the clarity you couldn't manufacture beforehand tends to arrive once you're moving. Not immediately, not all at once, but incrementally, steadily, as the work reveals itself to you through the doing of it. This trust is not blind optimism. It's earned through experience. The experience of having started without knowing exactly where you were going, and having found the way anyway. Of having written a bad first paragraph and found a better one on the third page. Of having made a wrong decision and learned from it faster than any amount of prior deliberation would have allowed. Of having begun something uncertain and discovered, somewhere in the middle of it, that you were more capable than you knew. People who start readily aren't more confident than people who hesitate. They're not free of doubt or uncertainty. They've just internalized something the hesitators haven't yet. That the starting itself is the strategy. That action is a form of thinking. That moving is, often, the clearest path to knowing where to go. The question worth asking. If you've been waiting to start something, a project, a habit, a change, and your reason is that you're not clear enough yet, it's worth asking one honest question. What would clarity actually look like? What specific information would you need to have before you felt ready to begin? Often, that question reveals one of two things. Either the missing clarity is something that genuinely requires research or preparation, a skill you need to develop, a piece of information you actually don't have, a conversation that needs to happen first. In that case, you have a specific next step. Go get that thing. Or the missing clarity is the kind that can only come from experience. The clarity of someone who has been inside the work and knows what it actually demands. In that case, no amount of additional planning will get you there. The only way to get it is to start. In the second case, more planning isn't preparation. It's delay wearing the costume of responsibility. The only step that actually counts. The first step doesn't need to be large. It doesn't need to be confident. It doesn't need to be the right step, it just needs to be a real one. Something that moves you from thinking about the thing to actually doing it. One paragraph, one conversation, one decision made and acted on rather than returned to the planning pile. Clarity follows that step. Not always immediately, not always completely, but it follows in a way it never does from the outside looking in. because the step itself changes your relationship to the work. You stop being someone who might do this and become someone who is doing it. And that shift, quiet as it is, changes what's possible next. The version of starting where everything is clear and the path is certain, that version mostly doesn't exist. Not for the things that matter. For those, there's almost always more uncertainty than comfort. More unknown than known. More fog at the edges than clarity at the center. But the clarity you've been waiting for isn't hiding somewhere in the planning. It's in the work itself. In the first draft, the first attempt, the first real step into the thing you've been circling. You don't need to see the whole path. You just need to see the next step clearly enough to take it. The rest becomes visible once you're moving.